you everyone for coming today. The Josep Lluís Foundation is built upon a commitment with values such as democracy, freedom, justice, and self-determination. We understand these values, we read these values through the lens of the Republican tradition, from the lens of through the lens of republicanism. So when our old friend from the University of Oxford, Peter Kraus, suggested us the idea of organizing an international workshop on republicanism, we thought it was a great idea. So this is the reason why we are here. You have the schedule already here, but just a quick reminder, we'll start well, now a bit late. Professor Kraus will deliver some opening remarks. Then at 10:30, actually, we'll start with the first roundtable about the main issues, some of the main issues and topics that republicanism is addressing today. Then at 11:45, maybe 12, we'll start with the second roundtable about the place of republicanism in Catalan history. Then we'll have a stand-up lunch over there. And then at 2:30, we'll resume the workshop with the third roundtable about national self-determination and non-domination. And we will end the workshop at, well, we'll start the last roundtable at 4 in the afternoon about Republican citizenship and diversity. And we will end the workshop at around 5:30, more or less. So this is the schedule, and I give the floor to Professor Kraus to introduce the workshop.
I guess I need the mic because of the interpreters, right? Because otherwise I wouldn't use it. Okay. Bueno, bon dia a tothom. Faig quatre paraules en català, no? Per introduir en la llengua local. I espero que tinguem una bona sessió. I switch to English so that everybody can understand me. This workshop has been in the pipeline, I don't know, for maybe 4 to 5 years. I'm not sure. We are one of the so many collateral victims of COVID, obviously, and I don't know how many times we had to postpone this. So I'm very happy that we meet in this. I don't know if it's a nice location. We could see the outside world if we tried, right? Which is not that bad for local standards anyway, but we won't see it. So we will have to focus on content today. And I will be very brief with my opening remarks, as far as I can see here, as we are running already behind the schedule. And I think we can even start not at 10:30, but at 10:20. Okay. So what this is about is already very clearly indicated in the topic. It's about republicanism today. And I think this topic has, well, it has many dimensions. There would be many ways of framing it. But I think when we were planning how to proceed here, we had basically three things in mind. The first thing would be the debate on republicanism in political theory, right? Which maybe for some of you is not the main field of your work. But I think that if you were political theorists, or if you are political theorists, what you might call the neo-republican turn of the last 2 to 3 decades has been one of the major developments in that area. And surprisingly, you have many trends which come and go. Communitarianism is almost virtually absent nowadays. Many other things as well. Multiculturalism has been declared dead for many times, but republicanism is still alive and kicking. So it's linked to names such as Quentin Skinner, Pocock, Christopher Pettit, and so on. And it's a very lively debate, which has many aspects. And I'm not an expert on this either, right? So there are some experts here, and I think it's their field to develop on this. So the value of republicanism today, from the theoretical angle, in terms of giving us concrete advice for solving political problems, because I think political theory is not an aseptic exercise. It's not something we should do in our academic offices and to get jobs and to get academic advances and so on. It should be practically helpful in politics, right? This is an obvious thing. So that's the first dimension. The second dimension, I would say, is the role of republicanism in real politics, in Realpolitik, as I would say in German. And here it becomes really complicated, or maybe at least complex. I think that's the second aspect. You have plenty of movements who declare themselves as Republicans. So if you say in the US, for example, where I just spent 3 months and I was talking about republicanism too there, if you say Republican, you are automatically labeled in a specific political slot where you don't want to be, right? Because there is a party in the US called the Republican Party, which may be many things, but it's not really Republican in the sense of the political theory debates we were just, I was just referring to. You have republicanism in France, obviously, which is a field covered by many different actors, opponents. Le Pen, Marine Le Pen is a Republican, Mélenchon is a Republican, even Macron is a Republican, so to speak. So the meaning of the concept becomes less clear. You have Irish republicanism, you have Turkish republicanism, etc. So it's very unclear to me, and it's a telling thing that there is not that much in political research on that, how the theoretical debate on republicanism relates to politics, to real life politics in the US, in France, in Spain, in Turkey, etc. I think that's the second field, which is also covered in the program, I guess. And the third one is basically, let's say, represented by my accent when I speak English, right? Which I think is rather Catalan than German. And it's the meaning of republicanism in Spain, and specifically in Catalonia, where you could say there has been some kind of neo-republican turn as well, because to my knowledge, I've been following the political developments here in the last 30 to 40 years, even professionally, very closely. There has been a neo-republican turn as well, in the sense that, for example, just to give you the most notorious case, what would be called nationalism / later on sovereignism / independentism today is often conceived of as republicanism. So if you speak of the Republican movement in Catalonia, you have kind of a proxy denomination for all those political forces, which are actually many in Catalonia, the bulk of them, who may not be exactly advocates of independence, but who would argue that independentism is, or self-determination is a practice which may enable Republican politics, in the sense of, that's the key point, I think what brings the three dimensions together to some extent is the attempt at creating political practices which enable non-domination, right? So that people are not dominated for unjust reasons, be it economic. I think that's the topic of David Casassas, for example, who I don't see it actually. Sorry, perdona. And political, right? Which would be the issue of structural minorities such as the Kurds in Turkey or the Catalans in Spain. I think that's more or less the frame of the workshop. I hope, I'm sure that I omitted many important things, but three important things I mentioned at least, and I think we can open.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you very much for being here, both to the speakers of all of the roundtables and also to those of you that today come as part of the public. It's a pleasure to take part of this, and also to see all of you here interested in debating and in learning about today's republicanism. I'm sure that we will have very interesting presentations today and also very interesting debates. And indeed, the program is quite intense. And I'm going to be just moderating the sessions, so I will try to speak the minimum possible to allow time for the speakers to, and also to the open debates that we will have at the end of each session. That means at the end of the three presentations. And this will be the structure of all the sessions, where you will be able to ask anything you may want to the speakers. So this first session is devoted to discussing what are the main issues and challenges of republicanism in these days. And in particular, the speakers have been proposed to discuss questions such as what are the economic foundations of republicanism, or what is the relationship between republicanism and feminism, or between republicanism and global democracy. And for that purpose, I'm so glad to present Josep Lluís Martí, Judith Vega, and David Casassas, who have worked on these issues from different perspectives, and many others during their careers. And so even if I'm sure that it's not necessary, David Casassas is lecturer in social and political theory at Universitat de Barcelona. His work is focused on revising the Republican tradition from a contemporary perspective, and also on basic income, on which he has not only made very relevant contributions from an academic or a theoretical perspective, but he has also been very active in paving the way to bring it closer to reality in the present. He has published numerous articles and books, among which Libertad Incondicional, La Renta Básica en la Revolución Democrática, that has been very recently translated into Catalan. Josep Lluís Martí is Associate Professor of Philosophy of Law at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra, the UPF. His research is related to new forms of citizen participation, to the democratization of global and international institutions, to the role of new technologies in democratic systems, or to the intersections between deliberative democracy and Republican theory. He's also very active both in academia and outside of it. And among other things, he has published the books La República Deliberativa, or A Political Philosophy in Public Life, this letter with Philip Pettit, or among the latest articles he has published, Global Solidarity and Collective Intelligence in Times of Pandemics. And Judith Vega is lecturer in social and political philosophy at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Her research addresses the crossroads of politics and culture throughout the history of modernity. And among other things, feminist philosophy and its intersections with Republican theory has been a central topic in her research career. And some of her titles are the book Cultural Citizenship in Political Theory, or the chapter Toleration of the Enlightenment from Limiting State Power to Empowering Citizens. So without further delay, the floor is yours. You have about 15 or 20 minutes, so try to stick to the time, please. And no. No. So we can start with David, then Judith, and then José Luis. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sara, for this generous presentation of we all. It's not easy to reflect on the economic foundations of. By the way, Guillem, thank you, Guillem, is circulating a handout for you to follow the line of argument and to see that I'm making some progress. So if you think that the end of the speech is far, or you'll see that in some way I'm closer and closer. I was saying that it's not easy to reflect on the economic foundations of Republican freedom in 15 or 20 minutes. I understand that we're having a long intertwined debate today, and I'm really happy and very thankful to the Fundació Irla, Josep Irla, for having this opportunity to contribute to it with some thoughts. So in order not to beat around the bush and miss the line of argument, I've organized my presentation into 6 steps or points or theses, or we'll see. First one, I think the starting point should be a discussion of the Republican social ontology, from Aristotle to Marx, if you want. World is crisscrossed by all sorts of asymmetries of power and bonds of dependence that have their origins in a dissimilar access to many kinds of resources, both material and immaterial. And this is the reason why there's need for politics, for a republic, for a res publica, a public/common thing, doing something for individuals and groups, mainly institutionally extirpating those power relations that tie so many people to others. I think this is the main difference vis-a-vis liberalism, which limits itself to equating freedom to equality before the law, economic freedom, you are free if the law treats you equally, which is extremely important, of course. But then again, regardless of the material and symbolic conditions that rule the world harboring such law. So please notice that I'm not considering Rawlsian liberalism here, which I tend to see as an academic oddity that is closer to republicanism or even to socialism than to actual, real existing classical liberalism. So to sum up, first point, you can have oligarchic republicanism as opposed to democratic plebeian republicanism, but you cannot have any kind of republicanism that denies, according to my point of view, of course, we can discuss that, that denies that social life harbors conflict, and that conflict emanates from a dissimilar access to crucial resources. This is why nobody before the 19th century, and this includes John Locke, Adam Smith, one of the authors I've been working quite a lot, or Immanuel Kant. Nobody before the 19th century would assume that a poor person who must sell her labor force or a woman who depends on her husband is a free person, a free chooser, in the terms used by Philip Pettit. So if such a Republican social ontology is denied, and in fact it is systematically denied when liberals say, for instance, that nobody forced you to sign that labor contract you seem to dislike so much, liberals have a purely psychological social ontology. Social life is strictly made of wishes and preferences that tend to match. Okay, if such a Republican social ontology pointing at social conflict emanating from a problem of scarce resources is denied, then there's no need for a republic, for republicanism, and for workshops like ours. But the main point is that such Republican social ontology is fundamentally true. And this we know since Aristotle's sociology within his politics, and even before that. Second point. So there's need for a republic. Why? I'll be landing into economic issues immediately. Well, the main task of the republic is to eradicate, as much as possible, all forms of power relations, of bonds of dependence, all forms of dominion. And here the idea, I suggest, the idea of a materially grounded personal independence, plays a crucial role. As a Republican polity needs agents that are capable of holding the other's eyes without having to turn your head down because it occurs that they materially and or symbolically depend on others. Hence, Philip Pettit's idea of free choosers that, thanks to a social position of invulnerability, are effectively capable of making free choices in their daily life. And hence, Pettit's famous tenet, this is a quote, that if a Republican state is committed to advancing the cause of freedom as non-domination among its citizens, then it must embrace a policy of promoting socioeconomic independence. This you can find in his 1997 book on republicanism. A very important clause needs to be introduced here. World is and will always be made of massive doses of interdependence. This cannot be denied. And besides, I think this is very good news for all sorts of moral and psychological reasons. Republicanism is a political project committed to a non-atomizing, materially based personal independence, but to a materially based personal independence leading to an interdependence that respects the autonomy of all parties. We'll immediately see which mechanisms can make it possible. So the bottom line is that all atomistic views of freedom must be, and of social life in some way, must be avoided. Third step. This requires, to start with some institutional concretizations, this requires unconditional, this is one of the issues I've been working on, unconditional access to material resources of many sorts. Unconditionally enjoying material resources, and maybe symbolic ones as well. Having our right to social existence guaranteed enhances our freedom as non-domination. Why? Well, because it gives us bargaining power, and this is maybe one of the keywords of my presentation, bargaining power that makes it possible for us to refuse unwanted social relations, starting with those that take place at home or at the workplace, not to become isolated atoms lying on the sofa, but to feed all those relations and projects we might want to feed and enjoy. And nowadays, due to this possession, we cannot feed and enjoy. So there are several positive actions to take, several yeses to pronounce that very crucially depend on effectively having the power to say no to other arrangements. Hence the proprietarian nature of republicanism as I see it. Property has historically been seen as the institutional guarantee of those social positions of invulnerability and bargaining power deriving from it. But property shouldn't be understood as the pure act of having a legally sealed property title in your pocket. This is a way, of course, this is a way, but not the only one. I think property has to be understood in broader terms as control, individual and collective control over a certain set of relevant resources in the making of the economic realm of our societies. Of course, the relevant question of all times has been and is, well, yeah, but property of what? Which are those relevant resources in the making of the economic realm we need to be able to control? Classical answers to this question, from Greece to Rome and Rome to the founders, have included land, cattle, even slaves. As Tony Domènech, my PhD director and one of the sources of my work, explained, the collective property / control over the means of production was a Republican response to this very same question given, in this case, by socialisms, in plural, in the 19th and the 20th century. Now, in keeping with all these views, one of my contributions, as Sarah was saying, to the Republican debate has to do with a proprietarian, if you want, defense of basic income together with other unconditional in-kind policies. Basic income alone is a nightmare, as a guarantor of Republican freedom. Beyond other technical but very political issues, such as avoiding the poverty trap, escaping from the social stigmatization you must face when you're a recipient of conditional cash transfer schemes, and dodging huge administrative costs, beyond all this, which is important, what is the Republican rationale of the unconditional access to a regular stream of resources, such as income, but not only? Well, this has to do with the ex-ante pre-distribution rationale as opposed to ex-post conditional mechanisms. If we operate ex-post, what we are doing is sending people, we are sent to a certain status quo that is taken as a token, as a given. We are forced to engage with that. And if things go bad, we are assisted. But there's no moment in this itinerary in which we have, say, seen, analyzed this status quo and been able to escape from it and erect other kind of social relations, starting with labor relations. On the contrary, if I get out of the house, or I get in the house where there's also conflict, empowered with resources, material and immaterial, cash and other things, have the right to decide whether I want to engage with those social relations, or I try to nourish other kind of social relations with people along the lines of other principles. We can discuss that more calmly in the questions and answers section if you want. Fourth step. I already announced that I will skip the fifth one, but let's focus on the fourth and the sixth. But can unconditionality create a problem of lack of reciprocity? Is guaranteeing something for nothing is guaranteeing something for nothing compatible with the moral and political infrastructure of a society, especially of a Republican polity? Well, three considerations. First one, unconditional access to resources guaranteeing your existence should be understood as a right that constitutes citizenship itself, because no individual and collective sovereignty is possible without bargaining power for all. Think of the left wing of the French Revolution, Robespierre, for instance, claiming that the right to existence is a priority, while other rights, property rights especially, should be subordinated to it. Second, it is equally important that we understand wealth as a social product, as the material and immaterial result of common endeavors of many sorts. As Mariana Mazzucato points out, goods and services, wealth in general, are only possible insofar as they are part of dense nets of knowledge and information flows and collectively made material spaces and devices. This means that wealth does not come from individual merit, or at least it does so very partially. But it is the heritage from past activities and the result of many forms of alien yet widely intertwined efforts. To go no further, think of all care work that permits all other kinds of work, paid or unpaid. Therefore, Varoufakis adds, wealth needs to be distributed through a social dividend, channeling the return of all those efforts to all of us. Third and finally, a broad and fully open understanding of work and even of human action needs to be embraced. What does it mean to do something? Catalans do things, Mariano Rajoy did say at some point. No? What does it mean to do something, to contribute something? Does it have to do with a final production of something? Or we should consider a wider and long process, including taking your time to think, plan, try, rectify, restart, share, evaluate, and so on. That is to say, all these things that rich people do. It seems to me that doing something should include all these actions. It seems to me that defining action just as doing what an employer externally tells you to do in order to achieve an immediate goal is a very poor, restrictive notion of human action and human contribution to society. So if we take these three issues into account, the right to existence as a right that is constitutive of citizenship, wealth as a social product, and a broad understanding of work, and conditionality appears to be precisely, we can discuss that, the guarantor of reciprocity, because reciprocity is the collective act of setting up and mutually taking care of forms of interdependence that are the result of genuine and dominated decision-making processes and courses of action that respect the autonomy of all parties. And this requires bargaining power for all parties in the workplace, in the household, as producers. We have discussed that with Luis many times, willing to access certain markets, etc. In other words, what really needs to be avoided is current interdependence, where people are forced to contribute not because of civic commitments, but because of long-standing intentional processes of dispossession that compel them to live at others' mercy. I think that's the problem. The fifth point had to do, and it's very important, this is extremely important, with the fact that even if you empower people from below, you don't have Republican freedom if you don't control great accumulations of economic power. The problem of economic monarchs, as Roosevelt put it, echoing views of Aristotle, Machiavelli, and even Adam Smith, by the way. We wrote something for AINAS a couple of years ago, I think, on this point. But I skip this, and if you want to, we can discuss it later on. Sixth and finally, do I have 3-4 minutes? See? Great, wonderful. This is the tricky question on the tension between the Republican understanding of freedom and capitalism as a social formation. If we understand Republican freedom as we have done, or as I have suggested to do, and if we therefore consider measures and institutional devices like those I've discussed, basic income, but the rationale behind basic income. Can we conclude, and also the control of great accumulations of economic power, which I've skipped, can we conclude that democratic republicanism forces us to explore post-capitalist social and economic scenarios? In other words, to what extent, if any, can we say that capitalism blocks republican freedom? Here we must be crystal clear. I mean, the problem is not, according to me, the problem is not the presence of private property and markets. The left sometimes get a bit confused with that. We, the left. We, I mean me. I'm talking about you. Although I can infer some things, but anyway, the problem is not private property or markets in abstract terms. The problem is the fact that under capitalism, not before, private property tends to mean excluding, dispossessing private property, the famous absolute dominion over the resource, as Blackstone put it. As well as the problem is that under capitalism, not before, markets, especially labor market, but not only, become structurally unavoidable social institutions. Again, because of capitalist dispossession. Let's focus on markets. Karl Polanyi was very clear. Markets are not intrinsically degrading institutions. In fact, Polanyi said, markets are essential in complex societies like ours. The tragedy of modernity, Polanyi said, is the loss of individual and collective sovereignty vis-a-vis the decision on whether to resort to markets or not when it comes to shape socioeconomic life, as well as the loss, once within markets, of the individual and collective sovereignty vis-a-vis the decision on how to politically shape those markets. Due to this possession, individuals and groups, one, need to enter labor markets to earn a living, and two, need to go to markets of goods and services to get what they need in terms of consumption and so on. This is why Ellen Maxine-Wood, in her account of the origins of capitalism, explains so bluntly that under capitalism, market relations are not an option, but an imperative, a matter of coercion. These are the rules of the game, and end of the story. So if Republican freedom is to be embraced and universalized, because we don't want oligarchic forms of Republican, but democratic ones, in contemporary societies, I suggest, along the lines of Polanyi, that we put on the agenda the two following objectives, and I finish with this, which aim at undoing the tragedy of modernity I outlined before. And then we can discuss, if you want to, how to achieve these objectives. Firstly, individuals and groups need to keep or get social power, as Eric Olin Wright would say, to decide when to resort to markets and when to use other social institutions to channel economic life. This very specially implies that even if the labor force does not need to be actually decommodified, every single worker needs to have the right to decommodify her labor force if she wishes to do so and make other arrangements like cooperatives, mutual support networks, and a very long, etc. This is not an academic oddity. Remember the Republican principle upheld by the International Labor Organization. Work is not a commodity. In fact, the bulk of the Republican tradition, from Aristotle to Marx, has seen wage-earning work as a freedom-limiting social relation. Well, and this is one of the reasons why unconditional measures such as basic income, I think, play or can play a crucial role. And secondly, if we opt for markets, individuals and groups need to keep or get social power to intervene in the decision-making processes regarding the nature of those markets. Because as we know, against the neoclassical backdrop or liberal backdrop, all markets are politically constituted social institutions, the nature of which is decided somewhere, somehow. As Dean Baker bluntly put it, there is always market regulation. What it is about is knowing who benefits. And I would add, from a Republican perspective, markets should be regulated. That was the nature of our discussion. The nature of our discussion. Markets should be regulated in a way that frees them of any form of social and economic privilege. I think all these issues place us, if not beyond capitalism, at least at the frontiers of capitalism, or if you want to, of current forms of capitalism. And my question with which I finish is, will we dare imagining other ways, non-capitalist ways, to conceive of and put into motion economic life? Well, I think a coherent analysis of the economic foundations of Republican freedom for all forces us to do so. So thank you very much, and I leave it here for the moment.
Thank you. So I will touch on several topics relevant to this relation, and they are mostly well, coming from my own discipline, which is political philosophy. Perhaps things will go a bit fast, but I hope that I still can give some impression of what I think is interesting. And I will start from the premise that mainstream Western feminism has become much too liberal, and that it needs vaccination of republicanism immediately. I think Western feminism has become biased towards a certain liberal success it certainly has had, which is mostly juridical success, I would say, and perhaps in some senses institutional successes. It also, with that, has become biased towards individualistic success, wealth, personal happiness, and a juridical or managerial angle to equality, diversity, or emancipation generally. And we already see a lot of dissatisfaction with this sort of feminism arrive through various platforms. But I think republicanism can have some answers to issues that are in play here. The other concept of the equation, republicanism, we have read a lot in the last decades on how republicanism is expected to repent vices from the past, from classical republicanism, and that it should grow more liberal. It should approach liberalism more than its own heritage. Philip Pettit is precisely one of the defenders, I think, of that position. These vices, to list them briefly, are, of course, that it would see participation as intrinsically valuable, and with that demanding too much of the modern citizen. And it has led to a distinction between strong republicanism, which presupposes such an intrinsic value, and instrumental republicanism, which would be the Pettit variety, more or less. It's also accused of a moralized idea on the polity, leading to communitarian, nationalist, patriotic takes on the common good. And this would expose it to, well, sorts of populism that would not be a right political choice. The third one would be that it is demanded to elaborate its idea of law in the direction of putting it in the service of non-domination. And also here, neo-republicanism has already done a lot of work. But all these reproaches, I think, are only very partly correct, if they are correct. And I would rather return republicanism to its own past rather than to the neo-republicanism that we see today. There are very interesting elements precisely in its own tradition, and I would actually call for republicanism to become as liberal as possible. There is also a not very well known, but still very vibrant history of feminist republicanism itself, from the very beginning of modernity. From the word go, we see women during the French Revolution and elsewhere, American Revolution, appeal to the ideals of antiquity and the polis, etc. So also this should be researched better and be valued for its own sake. Of what use is republicanism to feminism? What can it offer feminism? So I have a list of the famous key topics in republicanism, its concept of freedom, its concept of action, and what I would call a non-naturalist ontology of subjects, identity, gender, which constitutes an alternative to liberal ontology, actually similar to what David was saying, I think, more or less in the former presentation. As to the first, the concept of freedom, it's still a very important thing to keep reflecting on and keep putting on our agendas, that there is another concept of freedom than a liberal one. We are only free when the whole is free. We are not free on our own. And I think this has become lost in what I call the predominance of liberalism within feminism today. Careerism, etc., girl bosses, lean in, all those sort of trends and banners have had enormous attraction, and I think we should really push against it. Another way to formulate is with wink to Quentin Skinner's book title, Liberty Before Liberalism, an interesting research into what he calls the neo-Rowan idea of liberty. I would say that our question now is there liberty after liberalism? So that's where republicanism should have an answer. Second, its notion of action. Several concepts are in play here. I think republicanism's notion of action is characterized by seeing it as having a contingent onset and a contingent end. And that is a conception that pushes back against the idea of action as control, a controlling form of agency. And for that precisely, we should go back to antiquity, or to Hannah Arendt, who for that also goes back partly to antiquity. There's a cluster of themes here. And let me briefly a list of some of the crucial issues. Republicanism does not assume pre-political identities which are then expressed in the public sphere, in the polis or in the state. It entertains a performative view of politics, which means that the acting itself produces the self as well as the world. The world is at once made by humans and not controlled by them. Public activity is something that takes place in contingent contexts. It is more about creating public presence as such than about victorious or goal-effective outcomes. Public presence signals the very human capacity for action, and I, of course, here lean very strongly on Hannah Arendt's presentation of that. But it's public presence, public activity presents the very possibility of such action, and that's why it should be kept alive. And in Arendt's terms, it is to reveal the absolute plurality of mankind, and from there reach what she calls relative equality. I quote, "Our political life rests on the assumption that we can produce equality through organization." So this is an important alternative to the liberal idea of a natural equality of all. She says we are not natural equal. No one is something from nature. If we are anything, we are different, we are distinct, all of us. And what we have to do through organization, through society, is create relative equality, and that she distinguishes from from relative difference, which would be all the religious identities, nationalist identities, etc., that assumes some sense to being Dutch or being Catalan, to honor this audience. Action is not controlling, it is undetermined, and it is unpredictable, it's open-ended. It therefore involves vulnerability. So this is a very different concept of having the best career of all colleagues. Well, you can fill in the rest. It is to enter into a vulnerable situation and accept the consequences of that. It allows a pluralistic world to come into being. The original plurality of mankind should be expressed in the public sphere. And it is therewith an open process of the production of the political. I will a bit later come to another topic on the next slide, but I will already mention that Arendt speaks of the vulnerability of acting and speaking because they are closely connected. According to her, acting is always also, or should always be a sort of speech. You have to say what you're doing. You have to enter into discourse. And the problem of speaking in public, I think, is now very much a feminist topic. It has become problematized in all sorts of ways. And the most recent concept that has done that is the one of hermeneutic injustice, or epistemic injustice, as it is also called. And I think there's an important contribution for republicanism to make here, which cannot be delivered by liberalism, because liberalism assumes this natural subject who has her interests and her opinions, and they're put into the public sphere, and he expects that to be honored. But that's not how it works. Hermeneutic injustice says that precisely the recognition of who can speak legitimately and who not is crucial for our institutions and also for our private context. Okay, the third one, a non-naturalist ontology of subject, identity, and gender. This arises from the former 2 points. We see here an alternative to a liberal ontology, an alternative to this naturalist idea of the subject that we still tend to hang on to in our daily functioning, I think. I have myself researched the way in which already early feminist republicanism during the French Revolution uses republicanism to doubt the naturalness of femininity and masculinity, for example. Already say, well, it's what we do. Not precisely in present-day postmodern terms, but it's that's somehow the bottom line. And I think this also shows the wrongness of the complaint that I just mentioned against republicanism, that it would tend to communitarian, nationalist, or populist identities. I think it is precisely against identity politics. It resists the idea that there is something before politics that should be expressed in politics rather than being produced through mutual action and hearing and speaking. Okay. The challenges, because it's not just good news, there are, I think, also challenges that republicanism, which of course should be feminist, so I've put it between brackets, but I mean, we are here to have non-domination, so what do we want? So challenges for feminist republicanism. Again, three, the focus on freedom as such, the focus on agency, and the focus on republicanism as the theory of government, which again, of course, pushes back a bit against Philip and his co-workers in that direction. So republicanism, I think, can be credited for holding dear to the constituent power of citizens. Citizens are the ones who make the polity and should have the power to make the polity. These are the philosophical concepts in play. It's called constituent power. It's kind of popular sovereignty, but not so much by the populace as by the citizens of some locality. So republicanism holds dear to the constituent power of citizens. It also keeps a watchful eye on what we call constituted power, which would be the law, the rules in play, the state, which is already there, the constituted power. But the problem is the third one. And I think republicanism has not a really easy angle to this one because of the former focuses. It offers little purchase on constitutive power, the power that precedes the subject, that is structural, the societal structures, the historical structures that are in play before we act, before we are even born. So the structural historical modes of values and orientations that already shape the subject and his or her choices. And I don't know, and I haven't read recently a contribution that, well, one actually, Michael Thompson has tried to address this. But not, from Republican theory itself, there's not an easy angle, I think. It would need be assisted by other disciplines. Concepts that should be used here are symbolic order from psychoanalysis, it's ideology from Marxism, normalization from Foucauldian theory. And this level is difficult to combine with the focus on agency as present, I think, in republicanism, but we could talk about it. And so that was the focus on freedom, and it's closely connected to the next one, the focus on agency. Of course, Philip Pettit has made a great deal of this, how to understand agency and an agency free from domination. He calls this to resist the arbitrary interference with choice. And here already I get a bit nervous because these are very liberal concepts. This is not Republican idiom. This is liberal idiom. Free interference with free choice. This is, well, I mean, we probably have to quarrel about this, but or not, that's also possible. So I think this is pointing into a direction that I think is not sufficient for my goal, at least. His formulation, to provide citizens with the resources necessary to challenge laws and policies that they believe fail to promote a common interest. Well, there seemed nothing wrong with that sentence, but to provide citizens with the resources necessary to challenge laws and policies is again something a liberal would not contest, I think. And Philip Pettit himself has suggested or proposed simply the concept of discursive control, which is an interesting concept for my goals also, and his description of that. Agents are free to the extent that they have a ratiocination capacity for discourse and the relational capacity that goes with enjoying discourse-friendly linkages with others. So it's being able to talk, to have control over language in a sense. Cecilia Bord has followed him in this respect, also takes recourse to this idea of being a discursive subject that as a Republican category, to be non-dominated, she says, is to have a voice of one's own. It's to be proof against being silenced or ignored or refused a hearing. It's to get recognition as a discursive subject. So this is very close to what in feminism has been discussed as epistemic injustice, which means that language is not distributed equally, and speaking positions are often very hierarchical without trespassing any law. So this is a matter of, you could say, our life worlds, our daily practices. It's not a matter of the law, and I don't think the law has actually any form of control over discursive control. It's not a juridical issue, it's something else. So marginalization and silencing would be my addition, is not just a hermeneutical injustice in the sense of having no words, because precisely the acting subject of republicanism has all the language. He or she knows what she's doing. She knows how to formulate it. She has the background. So you can possess all the right language and precisely for that reason suffer epistemic injustice, because the organization will try to silence you, suppress you, fire you, whatever they can do. And often legally, because there's always a reason to fire someone. I mean, they're always very creative in those respects. Where I am. Yeah, so certain forms of agency in this respect will be resisted by an institution under full cover of the law. For example, if it collides with the overall market orientations, which are almost all our institutions now have embraced. Okay, my third one, I still have some time, a bit, okay.
A couple of minutes.
Okay, I'm now almost at the end of this one. Again, Pettit, he says, of course, that's part of the title of his book, Republicanism, the Theory of Freedom and Government. It thereby purports to be a theory of institutions. Law and its affiliated institutions should be oriented firmly towards non-domination. Also, the state itself should not be a dominator. So that's part of the same concern with non-domination. And Pettit wants to flesh this out through the concept of constitutional provision. And he describes that as the strategy of having a state that seeks to promote non-domination by non-dominating means. And the approach then concentrates on judicial powers, and it's state-centered again. It's the government that has to provide the means for non-domination by constitutional provisions. And my problem again here is this sounds very much like liberalism. I don't think any liberal would have some beef with this. Why? The whole idea of the separation of powers, etc., has a long tradition, also apart from republicanism. So now I'm going to say something that's probably unexpected and probably also very controversial. But I don't want feminism to have too much faith in law or in the state. I don't think the history of feminism gives reason for that. And very practical examples for my skepticism here is precisely the very feminist areas of sexual violence and intimidation, or indeed also hermeneutic injustice. These are covered in law. Rape is forbidden, but both the report percentages as the conviction percentages are abysmally low. It's around 5 to 10%. So what about domination, which occurs despite the law? And this is what Pettit actually, I think, cannot address well enough from his state-centered, much too liberal idea on how to redress domination by institutions. Again, one more worry I have is, now I have examples from my own country, but I think it's much more than a Dutch problem. It's at least European, if not worldwide. We have seen in the last decades a host of mostly journalistic reports on domination by institutions and in institutions, badgering, sexual harassment, racism, fraud. There's really no week, not some report is issued, of course, also because it's not on the agenda, but still. And these are very reputable institutions, such as the tax department, immigration and nationalization service, the military, the police, fire brigades, sports organizations, a whole variety of them, churches, universities. I mean, these are the normal institutions of our liberal states. And apparently we don't have any means to forbid what is already forbidden by law. There are, of course, a lot of policies, and the things are solved also by feminists themselves in managerial ways. We need policies. We need, again, some official, some confidential advisor, etc. But they're always in the same institution, and mostly these things work to promote the legitimacy of the institution as such. It also involves often co-worker complicity, which again precisely results from attachment to the institutions which they like and which give them a paycheck. And the tendency often is this does not happen here. Of course, that's the very non-Republican idea to domination. Domination does not happen. It cannot be true, but it is true, and it's not pushed back enough by either law or managerial devices. So now the pretty broad sort of issue I would like to present is that I think the orientation towards institutional transformation is right as such. because we live and work within all sorts of institutions. But I don't think we should orient republicanism towards a belief in institutions as guardians of non-dominance. So I think current Republican theory faces at least two challenges here. Institutional republicanism has too liberal a conception to grasp institutional problems of gender inequality or intersectionality, if you want, which are very close, I think. And a managerial entrepreneurial turn, because our institutions expect us to be entrepreneurs. They have a very capitalist economic idea on what a good worker is, and that is not confined to industries. That's precisely present also in all sorts of public institutions. And I think that republicanism has to answer the Foucauldian challenge. The work of Michel Foucault has precisely addressed this problem, how institutions as such know how to draw consent from their own co-workers by promising them some ideal on work, which is the entrepreneurial ideal, which individualizes, which has a very neoliberal effectiveness about it. And it does this not so much by overt domination or old-fashioned capitalist suppression or extraction, although it does extract, but it does so by consent. We want to be the good entrepreneurs. We want to get higher in our careers and to have even more output, etc., etc. So I think republicanism has to answer the Foucauldian challenge to the modern institutions, which Foucault describes as a sort of power block where sovereign, legal, and disciplinary power, normalizing power intersect. And again, I don't have the answers here, but I do think that Republican theory should attend to this. Changing institutions is not a matter of better policies. That's the liberal answer. And I don't think that republicanism can abide by that. It's a matter of changing its life world. And the weaknesses within Republican theory in feminist respect eventually center around republicanism's lack of a firm grip on life world domination. That was almost my last sentence. And I think, well, let's simply leave it at that. I think the lack of a firm grip of life world domination in various respects, private lives, work floors, etc., is something republicanism should elaborate and think about. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sara, for the presentation, and thank you, Luis and Peter, for the organization and all the people who are involved in organizing this event. I will try to speak brief and stick to the schedule. And I have to start by saying that there was, when Luis contacted me the first time for inviting me to this, I thought that it might be a good idea to talk about republicanism and civil disobedience and social movements and civic power, and which is one of the things that I'm doing research on. But then I don't remember now why, but I decided to ask him whether we could change the topic, and he said yes. So I don't know if the final version of the program says one thing or the other, but I will speak, as Sara said, I will speak about global democracy and the global order. And I have to apologize to Victoria because she has already heard this presentation. She listened to it in another conference on republicanism. This is a sect that we meet in different places in the world, the same crowd. Sorry, because there's nothing, I'm afraid there's nothing new from what you heard in Baltimore. So what I want to share with you is what I'm now writing. I'm still working on it and finalizing now these days. It's a chapter of a forthcoming book, the Oxford Handbook on Republicanism. And there, basically, I focus on the idea of sovereignty and how republicanism, both historically, but mostly in the contemporary discussion, how republicanism has conceived state sovereignty. So it's basically a discussion between two views, as I will say in a minute, two different, very different views. The two of them are Republican, but two very different views of the global order. And I think at the very least, this is one of the important debates that republicanism has. Republicanism is a big family and with very different positions and views. And this contrast between these three different topics, property and economic inequalities, and on the one hand, feminism on the other, and then I turn to global issues. I think this is a good represent a good sample of the kind of discussions that we can find today in Republican theory. So I think, so the way I see the problem I want to tackle is, so in my view, and of course I'm working on this, so I might be biased here and I might maybe exaggerating the importance of this, but in my view, this is one of the most important discussions that we should have within the Republican theory or with other theories as well. So we are still suffering from a pandemic, just to give the easy example. We are still going out, hopefully, from this pandemic, and we have all seen how the pandemic has been dealt by different governments in the world. And we have seen, I think, I will try to be controversial here because I think this will stimulate the debate later. So let me say it very straightforwardly. I think the WHO, the World Health Organization, has been a disaster. And I think that the management they have done of this pandemic has been terrible. And I think that it's not, actually, I'm not blaming them. They have done all what they could, given the very limited budget and the very limited kind of power that the states have allowed them to have. So it's not their fault, it's the state's fault. It doesn't matter actually whose fault is, but the result is that the management has been terrible. And I think that what you can see in the WHO is even worse in other cases like climate change, the way we are fighting against climate change, where we don't even have a global organization. So in the case of global health, we still have, at least we have one organization, the WHO, and my judgment is they have done terribly in managing this crisis. In climate change, we don't even have a global organization, and this is also, to a good part, to a good extent, this is also the state's fault. So things are even worse. So I start from the end, actually, of my argument. So I think that we have a clear problem in this world. We are facing tremendous challenges. Many of them are global in scale, by nature. Climate change and the pandemic are only two examples, but there are many others: nuclear security, immigration, terrorism, financial regulations, and many other examples. And the global system is failing to address all these examples. And I think, when I discuss with international lawyers, even the most optimistic among them, they don't discuss this statement. So they accept that you can be more optimistic and say, well, there's room for reform. Let's hope that we will do better in the future, and don't see the glass half empty. See what we have done. And of course, we have done many things that are good. But I can acknowledge that, but this doesn't mean that we should not be clear when we say that the system is failing to address the problems that we have. So we need some solutions. And then that's why normative theory needs to step in and tell us if it's useful for anything, political philosophy, it should be useful for these kind of things. So we have a problem. Let's ask what kind of normative solution, normative political theory might provide. And republicanism is addressing these issues and is stepping into this discussion. And you can see these two views, as I said, that are important. And the Republicans are divided about this, which is fantastic, because that's what philosophers we prefer to do is discussing. So if we disagree, that's great news, right? So the problems are huge, but disagreement is to be welcomed here. And I will present the two views the best I can and the arguments they give, and I will give you reasons of why I think that the best view is the global one, the globalist one. But of course, I'm happy to discuss with you, and I expect that some of you will actually sympathize more with the other view, and I have very good friends in the other view. So it's not that I think that the other view is, the devil or whatever. So it's just a different way of looking at things. And I will try actually to emphasize the common grounds between these two views, which I also think it's important, because sometimes scholars, we tend to overemphasize disagreements and discussions, because that's our business, that's what we do, differentiate ourselves from the others. But then in practical terms, sometimes these discussions are not so important. I think in this occasion, the discussion is very consequential. So these two views are very different views about how the global order should be organized. Okay, so the two views, let me call them for simplicity, and all this, I mean, whenever you use labels, then there are always problems, but for the sake of simplicity, let me call them statism on the one hand, globalism on the other. First problem, globalism, globalists, they don't oppose states. They don't say that we should eliminate a state, that we should get rid of a state, or that we should even get rid of a state sovereignty. That's not what they say. So it might be misleading if we say statists versus globalists. Second problem, statists don't oppose the idea of a global order. It's not that they say we should get rid of global institutions, we should only have a state. So just let me clarify this from the beginning. Still, in the discussion, what makes more sense, to make sense of the discussion, is to call some of them statists and some others globalists. And I will try to refine the terms later. Let me just a very quick, how much time do? Sí, pero solo para tener una idea, porque quería poner el hasta 40. Vale. Okay, so just to give a quick historical reference here. There is this old debate in the Republican tradition of political thought about the notion of sovereignty. And normally this debate has been, and Petit, that has been mentioned in the previous presentations, and Skinner, that has been also mentioned, they have contributed to this debate importantly. And I would say the mainstream position here among contemporary Republicans is that there are two views of sovereignty that we inherit from history. One of them is the modern notion of sovereignty, typically associated with liberalism in modern terms, which is the view that comes from Jean Bodin and Thomas Hobbes, and even Rousseau had this view. And this view of sovereignty, if you remember, I don't know if you're familiar with the history of political thought, I will try to be very brief here, but this view sees sovereignty as something unitary, absolute, unlimited, and objective. And then if you have only one person or one body can be sovereign, if you have more people who claim sovereignty, then you don't have any sovereignty or any sovereign here. Sovereignty must be unlimited, must be unrestricted. The sovereign has no limits, at least in political terms. We're not discussing about whether there are moral limits to what they can do, but there are no political and legal limits to what the sovereign can do. This is the classic view. Let me call it the classic view. As it happens, and Judith mentioned the example of Skinner talking about liberty before liberalism. As it happens with this view, actually, even if we call this the classic view, because we have learned that this is the modern classic way of approaching sovereignty, there's an older view of sovereignty that comes actually from the Greeks, Aristotle, but also all the Republican tradition across history that sees sovereignty as something very different, as something that can be divided, fragmented, can not necessarily unitary, that can be limited in many grounds. And this, in the Republican tradition, this was associated historically with the idea of the mixed constitution, with the idea of the separation of powers, and blah, blah, blah. This is actually much older, and many people are now defending this view again. And as I said, it's in the mainstream position today, is that in contemporary Republicans, is that sovereignty, when we approach it from this internal perspective, so sovereignty, it's quite standard to distinguish the internal dimension of sovereignty from the external dimension. When we analyze internal sovereignty, the mainstream position among Republicans is the fragmented, divided, limited view of internal sovereignty. So what they say is things like The federalist arrangements, they are good because they satisfy the principle of separation of powers. And this means that sovereignty is not unitary, is actually shared, is divided. You have states having some sovereignty at the state level, and then the federal system having a different piece of sovereignty, and they have to cope with each other. It's not, there's no one single ultimate absolute sovereign here, but sovereignty is actually divided and fragmented. This is, as I said, mainstream. That doesn't mean that everybody agrees with that, but at least among Republicans, it's quite uncontroversial that this is the preferred view in the internal dimension. But then when we move to the external dimension of sovereignty, how sovereignty reflects over the international order, here is where the division, as I said, there is this divide, and Republicans divide across two positions at least, maybe also some intermediate one. But the two positions are the one I mentioned that I called statists. They are people that even if they defend this fragmented, divided notion of sovereignty for the internal dimension, when they discuss external issues or global issues, they defend actually a unitary notion of sovereignty. And they say that the state is the only, so that the international order, the global order should be based absolutely on the grounds of state sovereignty, the classic principle that comes from the Westphalian order, that the sovereigns at the international level are the states, and there are no other sovereigns in the international sphere other than states. So this is what statists would claim when they try to deal with the international order. And I will give you some examples now, turning back to the problem I mentioned at the beginning. But in opposition to this first position, you have the globalist Republican view, which says that for exactly or more or less the same reasons that we have defended the fragmented and limited and divided notion of sovereignty in the internal dimension, for similar reasons, we should also defend, or we could at least, it's not necessary that we are against defending a shared or sovereign or divided notion of sovereignty in the external dimension. Let me give you a couple of, or let me first give you a few names to put some faces in these two positions, and then I will give you a few examples. So who are Republican statists in this debate? Well, Pettit, that has been mentioned. It's funny because Pettit, everyone recognizes Pettit as one of the leading figures in contemporary republicanism, but then everyone likes to criticize Pettit. That's the most common sport. Yes, it's exactly that. No, he's happy. So, and that's our favorite sports is criticizing Pettit. And then you might, I mean, Pettit recognizes the importance of socioeconomic inequality and so on, but then it's too liberal and not sufficiently socialist. No, I'm not saying that you said this. I mean, many people say
I think he's not sufficiently socialist, but I didn't say he's too liberal.
But the same with Judith's discussion, and I've done the same in my own work. So, well, in this case, Pettit, but other people like Richard Bellamy, for instance, he has also defended this idea of statism, global statism, Richard Dagger, Quentin Skinner, Tim Sellers, and many other people. In the other ground, what we have is philosophers like Jürgen Habermas, even if he is reluctant to call himself Republican. I think he's a Republican. That's debatable, but I think he's clearly on this side. And also the late James Bowman, but also Daniele Archibucci, who is, by the way, landing today here in Barcelona, and John Dryzek, and many other people. And some Republican, contemporary Republicans have tried to defend some kind of intermediate position, and that's the case of Cécile Laborde, that was also mentioned, and Miriam Ronzoni, and Frank Lovett, and many others. So this is more or less the divide. Now, a few examples before I address the arguments and I conclude. So, as I said, there are common grounds among these people. So first of all of them agree that the international system that we have is tremendously flawed and imperfect. All of them agree on this. So we should take seriously the idea that we should reform the international system and the global institutions that we have. They are clearly inefficacious or inefficient or ineffective in dealing with the forms of global domination that we all can identify and describe. So it's not that none of them are actually defending what we have. All of them have a reformist agenda here, and the disagreement is about how we should reform what we have, but it's not a disagreement about how we value what we have in the how is it doing. They all agree that it's doing terribly. So that's one thing. And the second thing is they also agree And sorry, and I also wanted to add, so they all agree that we should reform it, and they also agree that we should reform it to make it thicker, to make global institutions stronger, to give more power to them. This is also an agreement. So nobody is saying we should reform the global system because we should go the other way around. We should go back to the kind of 19th century or the beginning of the pre-United Nations global order, in which global institutions are powerless. They are just coordinating agencies among states. Nobody is claiming this, as far as I know, in the Republican discussion. So they all agree that we should have a thicker system with stronger institutions, more power, and more even normative powers and capacity to legislate and so on. They all agree with that. They also agree that we should not have a world government or a global government. That's very important. Even globalists, they don't say that we should have a global parliament with global elections and a president of the world. Nobody is saying this in the Republican field. There are some crazy people who are saying this, but they are not Republicans. They are crazy Republicans, but they are not saying this. So they agree on these two grounds. We should reform the international system to have more of it, stronger system, and we should prevent or resist the idea, the temptation of building up a global state or a world state. Now, once said this, let me see the arguments. So what statists say, they have basically two arguments, is that if I characterize well but the debate, they have basically two arguments. They say, first of all, we should preserve state sovereignty because the states are the locus or the entities that have been able to achieve the highest level of self-government that we have ever achieved across history. So as long as we value self-government, and of course, I mean, as the other talks have also stressed, republicanism is deeply committed with the idea of self-government and democratic self-government. As long as we value this, we have a reason to preserve the states because the states have achieved the highest level of self-government ever. Democracies, so far, they have proven to be able to exist at the national level or at the state level. But it's very difficult, they say, to think about global democracy. That's one argument. And the second argument is, they say, as good Republicans, we should prevent global domination. That should be the main emphasis here. And of course, everything we do to try to build up a globalist international system, partly because of the first reason, because self-government and democracy is difficult actually at that level, at least more difficult, maybe not impossible, but more difficult. Then the usual instruments that we have of popular control will be more difficult also at this global level. So we have actually reasons to, yes, build or reform the international system to make it stronger and thicker. But the main entities, the main actors that should keep it under control should still be the states. And then these states, let's presume, let's hope, they will become more and more democratic. So the people, in the end, the different peoples that integrate the world, they will have means to keep their states under control, and indirectly they will have means to keep the international system under control. These are the two arguments, self-government and preventing global domination. Now, what globalists say to this is, and of course they add, but as I said, this is not controversial, it's not contentious because they all agree with that. They add, we should resist the idea of having a global government, a world government, because that could be, could lead to tyranny, to global tyranny too easily. There would be no counterpower to this global government. So let's resist this. This is an additional point they make. But as I said, this is not controversial because globalists agree with that. Now, what globalists say in response to these two arguments is the following. So the first thing is globalists are always called, when they defend global democracy, they are always said, that's nice. It's a nice idea. But, cosmopolitans have been always defending this kind of dream. And the best we can say, it's a dream. It's impossible. Forget it. I mean, it's not even in 300 years we will have a kind of global democracy. That's totally impossible. So they are used to be called idealists and utopian. That's the normal accusation that they receive all the time. So now they attack back to statists and they say, okay, let's look at the details of the statist Republican model and see how realistic it is. So for people like Pettit or Bellamy or Tom Cristiano, who also refuses the label Republican, but I think that he is very close to republicanism. When people like this, when they speak about the international order, what they defend is an idea, and I borrow the terms from Cristiano here. So Pettit calls it the Republican law of peoples, of course, after Rawls's idea of the law of peoples. What Cristiano says, and I think it's more descriptive, is that the ideal that they have for the global system is what Cristiano calls a free association of democratic states. That's the ideal. So ideally, all states in the world should be democratic, of course. Those who are not democratic, China, Russia, why don't we have a sustainable development goal? You know that we have 17 SDGs. Why there's no sustainable development goal that says we should protect human rights and democracy? Because China resisted this and imposed their agenda. So authoritarian, non-democratic governments, they are influencing the agenda. Of course, some of them are very powerful, and they don't have any democratic legitimacy. They are not, the government in China doesn't represent the people in China. They only represent themselves, because that's what an authoritarian regime means. The same with North Korea or any other authoritarian regime. So what they say is, ideally, in the ideal theory, what we should have is all states in the world should be democratic. And then all these democratic states who would be truly representative of their respective peoples, they should have a say in the global order, and they should build up the new system with some kind of agreement or consensus mechanism, or even with majority rule, but all together, presupposing that they are democratic. Okay, how realistic is this? So how far we are from seeing a world in which all countries are democratic? When do you think that China will be democratic, or Russia, or North Korea? It's 300 years or 30 or maybe 3 years. You think that in 3 years we will have this? So what they say is, okay, you are accusing us from being utopian, but the ideal that you propose in opposition, this is statism, doesn't look very much more realistic. On the other hand, we all see that there is global domination, and that states are proving very inefficacious or ineffective in preventing this global domination. We can see, I mean, as I said, and I'm concluding, we can put many examples of this. Just to mention one that I haven't mentioned so far. So we see the most important concentration of power in private hands that we have seen across history. Never before we had that huge concentration of power in private hands, in the hands of the 5 big technological companies, with all the access they have to data and actually how big they are and the rich they are. And it's very difficult actually to expect anything coming from the international system that can't put any limit to what they are doing. And we can see, many examples of this. So remember that for Republican terms, I didn't explain it, but in the other talks, it was also mentioned. For domination to exist, it's not necessary that you are actually interfered in what you are doing. It's just all what you need is that someone else has the possibility to interfere. And it's very difficult to discuss the idea that these big companies have the possibility to interfere in our lives. Actually, they say so. They advertise this because it's their business model. And actually, they are very convincing in showing that they are actually capable of interfering in our life very deeply and very consequentially. And they don't seem to be very restricted or limited by what any government is doing. And we can talk about this longer later. So I conclude with this. So we have this debate about 2 views of the global sphere or the international order. What you have is some agreements between these 2 views. Very important Republicans in both sides defending their views with good arguments, of course. These are all smart people. What they defend, it's important to clarify, I think for me, it's the most important thing, to clarify that they all agree that the current system is not working properly, that it needs to be reformed, that this reform means that it should be thicker and we should give more power to the international order. Now, if we give more power to the international order with good Republican hearts and minds, we should immediately react and say, look, giving power to some kind of transnational or even global institutions opens the door to too much risk in terms of domination. So this creates a challenge for all of us in both sides of the debate, creates a challenge about how to keep these institutions that we hope they can be stronger and more powerful, how we can keep them under control. And here, again, I conclude with this final statement. If before I said that the WHO has been terrible in managing the crisis of the pandemic. Now, let me conclude, it's not the worst organization at all that you can find in the international system, but it's quite paradigmatic, and it's actually what you can find with the others as well. The WHO is very little transparent, very little accountable. Nobody really knows how certain decisions are made, and the mechanisms, even from states, the mechanisms that we have of exerting control, final control of the decisions they make, is very little. The only good news so far is that they are powerless. They don't have much power. So they are little transparent, not controlled, not accountable, but they don't have much power. That's actually the problem I started with. But as long as we agree that we should give more power to these institutions, then we all share the challenge, no matter in which side of the debate you are. We all share the challenge of how to create new forms of international control. That's my final statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentations. You have touched on many issues that will be discussed further in other roundtables during the day. So now we have 15 minutes for questions. So we will gather all together because we have until 12 o'clock more or less. So please just raise your hands and we will give you a mic, I think.
Hi, thank you very much for these three very interesting presentations. My question is addressed to David. I completely agree with most of what you said, and I have a genuine doubt about something which gives me many sleepless nights, and is that asymmetries of power are not only based on the asymmetries in access of economic resources, but on other kinds of resources. And one kind of resource which is often overlooked is cognitive resources. Many of our citizens do not share the metacognitive capacities that allow them to participate in the public sphere or to defend their interests accessing the legal system as most other citizens can. And
Are you talking about human beings?
I am talking about regarding current citizens. I'm talking about children, and I'm talking about human beings with serious cognitive disabilities. And I, of course, believe that other individuals with similar capacities, like non-human animals, pose the same problem. But even if we don't think that, we're still facing the problem of human beings. And so this is a case in which they need the assistance of the cognitive resources on others, and that's a huge source of power asymmetry which unconditional access to economic resources cannot solve. So I was wondering if you had considered this issue, at least regarding even if we give them those economic resources, how do we protect them from the vulnerability from those who have power over them? Because that's something I'm very worried about.
Thank you to all three of you. I have two questions. I think one is rather for Judith, but maybe it also relates to the other two presentations, and one is for José Luis. Judith, I was very puzzled by your concept of hermeneutic injustice, which I didn't know, to be honest, right? And I assume that this is also closely connected to your ending with fighting life world domination from a Republican and feminist angle. I think this makes sense to me. Mm-hmm. But what I do not get then, if you speak of injustice, hermeneutic injustice, you will still need a standard for assessing what justice means in practical terms, right? He just mentioned the case of disability. Disability is in a way, it's a natural, a biological condition, right? I think you will need still external parameters, from my naive view, maybe, which make it possible to address injustice at all, like material conditions, issues of health, issues of, I think your approach to injustice maybe mildly anthropocentric, right? So I think it's not all in context in our activities. There will be structural issues which we need to address. So that's my question, which maybe it's not simple and you don't have to speak 30 minutes, but maybe you can tell me what I should read to get this this puzzle solved. And then to José Luis, in your case, my question is more simple. Because you left me, you did not reach the climax of what you were telling. So you are telling us basically two things: that we need global institutions that should be more powerful on the one hand, but at the same time more accountable. And then my easy question is how do we get these institutions? Again, not in 30 minutes, but maybe in 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. I also would like to ask two questions and try to put them shortly. One is also for Josep Lluís Martí. I was very convinced of your critique of status from a globalist perspective. I would be therefore even more interested in how you think of the recent invasion of Russia in Ukraine, because I think this is the most imminent example for the case of the statists. I think for two reasons. On the one hand, it really shows how important the monopoly of force is and the territorial integrity of borders. And second, what we see, what happened afterwards was the NATO coming together, which is of course a statist international institution. I would say, and if this is, I don't know, a sign for our times or something like that, then statists really have the case. Even though all these states won't become democratic, we really have to become realistic in a classical sense of the word in order to get those states in some direction to even be open to some form of global cooperation. For Judith Vega, my question is merely, are you a Republican at all, or are you simply referring to some notion of social freedom in a Hegelian tradition, which is then also informed to a Foucauldian critique? I find this very convincing for a feminist as you are, but I also thought that this is actually a position that is widely defended in feminism, and rightly so. For example, through people like Sally Haslingers. I would just be interested in your take on this and in your positioning in this feminist debate I just shortly referred to.
Okay, so thank you very much. We are running late, so I will ask you to be very, very brief because we have more or less 5 minutes. So go ahead.
Do we do the same in the same order?
Yeah.
Hello. Okay, thank you, Ezequiel. No? Yes. No, this is a very important issue. Of course, economic resources are not the only ones. I've been referring to symbolic resources, which have to do sometimes with the issue of recognition, the issue of I don't know, about women or people coming from certain geographical areas feeling with the right to say something, and because they are a part of the society, if we assume that this is the case. But of course, the issue of cognitive resources is very important as well. And this leads me to a paper I wrote with Jürgen de Wispeler, another usual suspect in these debates. I don't know whether he would be part of the sect, but he's sort of he republicaniates a little bit. Okay, we published something on Republican freedom and disability in disability in society, and well, in some way, what we were saying, not with these terms, but is that institutions, that's we'll have the debate, institutions themselves can be seen as an immaterial / legal resource to be universally good institutions. promoting Republican freedom institutions could be seen one of those resources to be universalized, especially if these institutions are capable of tracking the interests of these people who apparently lack certain cognitive resources. And here we made the distinction between the famous medical model and the social model, trying to say that we need institutions with a broad conception of what is being normal, or even more than that, without a conception of what is being normal, and harboring a conception of diversity of ways of living because of certain capacities we all have, and which are very different, as we all know. And here, and this we didn't add that in the article, but this has to do with more recent work I'm doing and my research group is doing. The principal agent model or relationship, I think, can be useful. I'm thinking aloud. I'm just and then we keep on discussing on all these things. We have many institutions like parenthood, but I don't like talking about parents and childs when we talk about cognitive lack of cognitive resources. But it's a good example, I think. Parents are the agents of their children who are the principal, but parents are not the owners of children. This is why when Partido Popular or the far right says that they are free to do whatever they want to do with their kids, so the society, the polity says, no, you are not I wasn't going to say fucking, you are not the owner of your children. You are the tutor, the trustee. In some way, there's some trust that both the child and the society gives you, or supposes that we can confer on you, because in principle, and if that's not the case, you will lose your kids. In principle, you have the capacity to track their interests that sometimes are a bit difficult to express, but they can be expressed in many ways. So I would say that it's a technical decision on how to track these interests, and then it's a matter of defining institutions where we can find trustees that understand that they only act, which is not a minor thing, as trustees, as agents of people who are the principals, but don't have the capacity to, by themselves, to follow the performance of their agents. Now, I know I'm not closing your long nights without sleeping, so let's keep discussing about that. But I'm contributing something to the debate to see whether this helps a little bit. Thank you for the question anyway. It's your turn.
Pick up mine. Well, several questions. First of all, am I a Republican? My credentials. I think that Republicanism has conceptual resources that other interesting political philosophies or social philosophies do not have. And I very much agree with Aaron that also in Marxism, there is not this reflective attention to what it means to be present in public, other than in the sense of participating in labor force. So I'm interested in this problem, which has a sort of autonomous status or individual status. It's also what did I want to add here? Yeah, the republicanism allows to talk about freedom not in terms of an individual autonomy, and that's what I think is also an answer here to what has been so appealing to many feminists, to have an autonomous individuality, and I think that has led to too much complicity with neoliberal programs, and I think republicanism can add its own conceptual resources here. As to whether it's anthropocentric, the very premise that we can only be free if the whole is free does not necessarily only include humans, I think. the whole should be free. And that's actually something also emphasized by Pettit in his early book on republicanism. Also, environment can be part of the whole because we can be dominated by our own choices, which go against our interest in environmental respect. So yes, I don't think it's necessarily anthropocentric and limited to that. The idea of epistemic justice, which I think is republicanism is in principle open to discuss, also is about giving voice to all sorts of knowledges, and that need not be an elite knowledge or the adult knowledge. Or republicanism does not have obstacles to the idea that in our wanting to be free as a whole, we have people and non-people represented that cannot speak for themselves. If we want the whole to be free, we have to take into account also the voices that are normally silenced from other perspectives, which are more anthropocentric or individualist, etc. So I think these would be my answers.
Yes, I have my, thank you. So thank you, I will be as brief as I can. So thank you, Peter, for the question. You're right that I didn't explain this. I skipped that part because I was running very late. So thanks for the question because you give me the chance actually to explain it. So how can we make it? What the globalists say, and that's actually the core, the nutshell, the discussion in a nutshell, the core of the discussion. What globalists say is the only sovereign actors in the international sphere are not states. States should be part of the international system. It's not, as I said, they are not against states. So states must be an important part, but they should not be anymore the only actors. If they ever were the only actors, at least the Westphalian idea was presupposing that the only sovereign actors should be states. That is wrong. And we should welcome the fact that there are different kinds of actors now already. It's not something that they defend for the 25th century. We can see already the emergence of non-state actors having some power. This includes some public non-state actors, such as other international organizations, sub-national regions, cities, the rise of global cities, for instance. And also include some private actors, non-state private actors, such as NGOs or civil associations. So what globalists say is when we go and see how the reality is, not when we discuss about the ideal theory that we might have, but when we see the non-ideal conditions in which we live, there are so many flaws in terms of democratic legitimacy in the international system that we should welcome any help that might be provided by all this plurality of actors. So many people, it's not only my view or not even the Republican view, because some non-Republicans are defending similar things. What they say is we should actually empower all these actors. For instance, in the example I gave with the WHO, we should empower NGOs or global cities or regions to have a more direct relationship with the WHO in order to help, to contribute, to keep it accountable. So that's the challenge. As I said, it's a challenge. I'm not saying that this is the perfect solution, but it's the solution they presuppose. And turning to Andrea's question, I think, the invasion of Ukraine, it's a kind of a traditional way of dealing with conflicts that involves war and aggression and so on. Let's assume, I'm not going to defend it, but let's assume that the invasion was illegal. And let's assume that some crime of wars have been happening in Russia. Let's assume that. You're right that what we have seen so far is a statist reaction. The explanation of why this is so, it's very simple. States are doing their best effort actually not to allow other people, not other actors to take power and be able to react to these things. And because we are talking about a very traditional kind of confrontation, it's obviously true that only armies can deal in one way with this conflict. And armies, so far, only states have armies. So you don't have other actors who might exert any kind of force. I'm not saying that the war is the only thing that is going on in Russia and Ukraine. There are many other aspects, but let's assume now that there have been these crimes of war taking place in Ukraine. Well, we all know that Putin will never be indicted for this. Why? Because Russia didn't ratify it, actually. They signed, but they didn't ratify the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So they are not members of the International Criminal Court. Even if what happens in Ukraine falls into the description of crimes of war, according to the Rome Statute, he will never be indicted. There is only one exception in which people who come from states that are not member states of the International Criminal Court might be indicted. And this requires the unanimous vote of the Security Council. We all know that Russia will veto that, at least as far as Putin is the president of Russia. So there's no chance that he will be ever indicted, and he will never have a trial on this. So for many people, this is the failure of the kind of a statist world in which we live. And we need to move forward, move towards something different that does not depend exclusively on the will, on the consent of states, especially if we're talking about the consent of non-democratic states. Because the one who decided not to make Russia part of the International Criminal Court was Putin himself, not representing the Russian people, because he's not a democratic representative of the Russian people. So it was not the Russian people who decided to stay apart from the International Criminal Court. It was Putin. I don't think that he was already expecting to invade Ukraine at some point, but in any case, it was good for him that he didn't decide to join the International Criminal Court. Now, as a matter of fact, he cannot be indicted. And this is the kind of limitations that we have in the statist world.